This all works. Ooh, okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you all. I just flew in from Boston, and so you might tell my accent. I have a very Boston-like accent here. You know, you're all interested in the medical sciences. You're all interested in how obviously humans develop and how we can be healthy and how we can cure disease. And I think it's an obvious statement for all of you. I think you all understand that prevention is better than cure in most cases. But what I want to do is I want to push back and we have toxic materials in the environment, don't we? We can't help but hear about the nasty stuff that's going on in our environment. We turn on the radio, we open up a newspaper, we look on the internet, we find out about all these nasty things happening. Chemistry's going bad here, bad things are happening there, bad things are happening here. All we hear is bad, 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 bad. All this molecules going all over the place as being bad. Wow, it's who in their right mind would want to be a chemist today and work in chemistry? You know, it's kind of an interesting problem. You know the game Whack-A-Mole? Have you ever heard of this game, you know, in the carnival, in which the little guy comes up and you hit it with a hammer, and then another one comes up and you hit it with a hammer? In the United States, we have the American Chemical Society. Okay, the American Chemical Society has a mascot, and their mascot is a mole. All right, and if you think about chemicals in the environment, we almost treat it like that game Whack-A-Mole. Right? You hear about brominated flame retardants, whack, and then all of a sudden you hear about phthalates, whack, and then you hear about bisphenol A, whack, and your head's spinning all over the time because once we start hearing about one nasty molecule, we start talking about another, and we start talking, and it's like, oh my God, I can't keep up with all of this nasty, nasty, nasty. And we live in a world in which we have no good conversation about the nasty. You know, if you think about it, it's all politics, isn't it? It's an epic battle of good and evil. There's evil here, there's good here, and we can't just sit down and have a good conversation about what's going on. It's almost impossible not to despair. Okay, and I gotta say that's the thing we've got to avoid at all costs. Can you imagine if Dr. Martin Luther King got up and said, "I have a nightmare"? You know, you might get some funding, but you don't motivate people to change. You don't motivate things to happen by despair. We have to believe in a positive thing. And so maybe, just maybe, we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the right question is, instead of saying, you know, all this chemical, what makes a molecule toxic, you know, ask the question, why would a chemist make a dangerous molecule? Why would a company make a red dye that causes cancer? Why would a company make a plasticide that causes birth defects? Is this an epic battle of good and evil? Are they just motivated by greed? Or is it something else? If we're going to really change the world, maybe we've got to ask ourselves why it happens in the first place. And so instead of how do we make chemicals, maybe we should ask ourselves, how do we train chemists? Because maybe, you know, they're the people that actually make stuff, right? And so I'm not one of these people that grew up with a chemistry set wanting to be a chemist when I grew up. I came from this huge Italian family in Boston. My mom had 11 brothers and sisters growing up. We were carpenters, plumbers, electricians. I had 35 cousins within a 1-mile circle growing up. And I horrified my family one day by saying I wanted to go to college. My father was mad. My 2 older brothers had good jobs. He was saying, what are you going to be, a professional student? You know, no. And so I made a deal that I worked in construction while I went to undergraduate. And in Boston, there's all these tunnels. I actually sandblasted the tunnels in Boston while I went to college. But what really horrified my family was not the fact I was going to college, but what I went to college for. I actually went to college as a music major. I went to UMass Boston, and I went and I played in this band called The Elements. Okay, I promise you, this had nothing to do with carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. I don't know. You can see there's a Rubik's cube there, and it was the early '80s. We considered these the elements. We sounded something like, you know the band The Cars? Well, we sounded a little bit like them with better lyrics. We were doing pretty well. We were playing in gigs 3 times a week in the Boston clubs, most of them dives, but they were okay. We were recording we were actually in a recording studio. We actually had a song on the radio in the Boston area, and all of a sudden, disaster happened, and the drummer of the band, my best friend, got leukemia, and over the course of 6 months, he passed away. So now all of a sudden, the band is gone. I got a lot of time on my hand. So at UMass, to be a music major, at the University of Massachusetts, to be a music major, you had to take all the general classes. You had to have an English class, a history class, a math class, a science class, and I was taking chemistry to fulfill my science requirement. And one day in the science teaching lab, in the chemistry teaching lab, this Professor Jean-Pierre Anselme comes into the chemistry teaching lab. He looks right at me, he says, music major, walks by, and he looks at the kid next to me who was a chemistry major, and he says, would you like to do research in my lab? Well, all of a sudden I have a lot of time on my hands, and so I said, can I come? And I walked into the chemistry lab. And I got to tell you, it was almost like an epiphany happened. Once I got into the lab, all the time I was taking chemistry in school, it was as if, why would anyone do that? All you do is you learn it to take a test, you get some check marks and X's, and you get a grade. I had no idea what a chemist actually did. When I got into the lab and I realized that chemists created, they innovated, they made stuff, everything I thought of as a musician, I saw as a chemist. I actually had this vision of ramming my head full of these electrodes and composing a piece of music on a piano or designing a molecule, and thinking that the same neurons probably fire. That when we invent, when we create, that's not art and science, that's human. And that the word art and science is some artifact that gets pushed upon us very early on. And because I happened to be marginally okay at music, I was an artist. And it never even occurred to me that science was something I'd be interested in. So once that happened, I got really hardcore into chemistry. So I actually published 5 papers as an undergraduate. I spoke in Washington, D.C. at 17 years old about my research. In fact, I got on the cover of Celebrity magazine with Boy George. Talk about a claim to fame. Not as a musician, but as a chemist. I'm home one day, and the phone rings, and this dude calls and goes, John Warner, we consider you Boston's best and brightest graduating college senior. We want you to come and have your picture taken. And I said, no. And I hung up the phone. They called back a couple minutes later. They go, really? We want you to come. And I said, really? And I hung up the phone. The next day, I go into school. I'm at UMass. I'm a chemist. I'm working in industry. I wasn't as snappy dressed back then as I am now. I was unshaven, working in the lab, completely ignoring this. And the chancellor of the university comes to my lab and says, you will go get your picture taken. So kicking and screaming, they grab me and they bring me and they drag me into this newspaper. They take this picture with all these snappy dressed people. You might not be able to see me there. I'm sitting there just hating life. And they did this story about this kid who had assembled 100 molecules that had never existed before. And I came to the stunning realization, I'm a chemist. Who would have thought that? And next thing you know, I don't know when I made the decision, but next thing you know, I found myself at Princeton University doing anti-cancer chemotherapy research. And I have the record at Princeton University for the student with the most publications and patents ever in their history. I published a lot of stuff, and I worked with a team of people to come up with Alimta. Alimta is the most successful anti-cancer drug in history. It's sold by the Eli Lilly company for solid tumors. So I got really into medicinal chemistry and solving these things. And just to show how weird society and science can be, I lost my mom a few years ago to lung cancer. She was receiving the drug that I had invented back 15 years earlier as a graduate student. So these relationships is kind of weird. Now, this isn't a drug that prolongs life. It was to improve the quality of life, so that she, was actually literally driving herself to chemotherapy up until a couple weeks before she passed away. So Princeton's very proud of me. They pat me on the top of the head. They take pictures of me in front of flags with books and, everything like this. This is my laboratory. My dad came to my graduation when I got my doctorate. I never told him I was a graduate student. I told him I was an apprentice, so he was okay with the graduate school thing. And about here in the lab, one day the phone rang.